Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of a six-part a series of workshops hosted by Re-Phew Consulting around the different aspects to navigate qualitative and quantitative research. This first workshop is going to look at research quality and looking at research quality in context of validity and ethics. These workshops will be available for your viewing, for your own viewing on the Re-Phew Consulting YouTube channel, and also available on the Re-Phew Consulting Instagram page. So you can pick up on the points, hit pause, take some notes, and hopefully it can help those of you who are looking to navigate aspects around your own research to hopefully collectively get a good overview around the different aspects to contextualize your research where applicable. So let's start with this particular topic about research quality. The workshop objectives will be thus. By the end of the workshop, you should be able to understand why validity and ethics are important entities. Um, Understand the process of constructing, for example, an ethics application as part of the research. And number three, another point is to acknowledge the codes and practices in context of research. Okay, so let's sort of plod on. So research validity. So I'm going to highlight a few points in context relating to quantitative and qualitative research. So in relating to a quantitative research, there are three aspects that align to the validity of research in what's referred to as quantitative research. Um, so there's the construct validity, which relates to how well your constructs are operationalized and represent the phenomena under which aspects you are investigating or you are studying. Then there's the internal validity, which looks at how far the research design allows you to draw conclusions about the relationships between variables. So any particular research project or a question that are looking to investigate will have generally speaking, may have one or two variables, but may have those variables may have sub variables, for example. So internal validity looks at how far the research design allows you to draw conclusions about the different relationships around the different variables that are within the constructs and confines around the different variables that may be part of the research. Then there's something referred to as external validity, which relates to how well your sample represents the population it's drawn from. So depending on what sort of research that you're doing and based on the question that is being asked, external validity looks at how well your sample and relating to the question that's being asked as part of the research represents the population of intrigue, and thus the population it's drawn from. So those are the main constructs around quantitative research, which relates to normally around a numerical aspects of research, and there will be another workshop that looks at this as well in a bit more detail. Then there's the research validity around qualitative research. So in this context, there are several sort of points I'm going to make here. Um, so in qualitative research and research validity around this, one of the points is about being able to triangulate. And so what that means is basically where, for example, if you've got as in um, in context to internal validity in quantitative research, in qualitative research, where there are variables and relationships between those variables, triangulate. If you imagine putting your fingers, your two index fingers and your two thumbs, from your right hand and then your left hand, if you join them up to make a triangle shape, what that it represents is to be able to join the relationships between the different variables so that the qualitative research is integrative. And integrative is also a word or terminology I'm going to use in relating to triangulation. So that's what qualitative research means in context of the research validity around that. So that's one of the points. Then the other point in this in around qualitative research is being able to check with participants. So those who have been approached and sort of are going to be involved in qualitative research in relating to whether it's doing simple interviews or it's trying to sort of document context that relates to what's going involved in the around those participants, and other aspects that relate to the participants. What triangulation or qualitative research does in relating to research validity is that the investigator should be able to check with participants what area of understanding they have in context with the research question. So that thus boosts or sort of brings more rigor and integrity to the validity of the research question and the research as a whole. And generally, qualitative research versus quantitative research is a bit more challenging because what happens is that in qualitative research there's an added layer around rigor and integrity because it does not rely on numbers or sort of on numbers or numerical data so much. It relies on the truthfulness around the questions that are being prompted or asked around different participants. So so in this context, being able to check with the participants is important. Then there's the point in relating to that, I guess, and I would like to add is to add is to be able to get rich descriptions around the different questions that are being prompted or are asked to different around different participants. So what this means is based on a question, and generally speaking, when designing sort of qualitative research questions should be open-ended. Thus, what that means is that all participants have every opportunity to add as much as they want to around a specific question that is being asked. And just to point out here, those who are checking out this workshop, there will be a workshop around research methodology in two parts. So there will be more around qualitative context and more around quantitative context in two different additional workshops. This is an overview workshop on research validity. Then there's being able to explain own bias. Now, what this means is that generally speaking, those who do qualitative and quantitative research, generally speaking, everyone has their own biases. They own their own research biases. And what this also means is that there is every scope in research in either of those two paradoxes is basically where, generally speaking, the investigator, the researcher, will have their own biases, and this also means to ensure there's research validity, rigor, and integrity. There's two parts to this. It's basically where the researcher can highlight from the outset that they have their own biases, but in doing so, when someone does that, they must, and it's absolutely integral, that context is highlighted with appropriate referencing or references where other researchers, investigators in the same or similar areas of practice around qualitative research have to be included or should be included in aspects of the research to some extent. And then part two of that is to say, to also highlight that where research biases are unavoidable or completely unavoidable, that the research and the investigator must or should endeavor to highlight what they did to ensure more validity and integrity around the research focus, so that those who read, for example, the research or look to understand what has been done in the research will get an understanding of how integrity was met and rigor was met as well. So, for example, in context with that, for example, though this workshop is about is a general overview, what I would like to say in this is also that what adds integrity or rigor is to have a peer review publication before embarking on particular aspects of quantitative or qualitative research, because it shows that, for example, the topic or the subject area or area focusing related to the subject has already been explored in some context, at least in part. So that then shows and proves, for example, that the work has already been explored as a baseline fundamental level, and this also means that the investigations that happen and take place thereafter should continue to obviously add rigor and validity, but also sort of offsetting any potential investigatory or research bias. For example, a peer review publication could be as basic as a literature review, for example. And so the next point I want to make on this is where research validity is concerned, a present or negative or counter examples. So what this means is that the validity around this is that basically, much like any sort of a fundamental baseline investigations that have been conducted and carried out, both positive and negative examples are included in the research, so that basically, again, aligned to research bias, it offsets and ensures that there's integrity around positive and the negative. And in qualitative research, it's very important that that is made known. And another part of this is being able to spend a long time in the field, understanding what's going on around different examples by, for example, potentially, let's say, for example, lived experiences for those people in and around specific healthcare conditions, and understanding what's going on with them. So being able to spend a long time or a time to understand, then that also adds not just research validity and integrity, but it actually, where qualitative research is potentially more fallible and more susceptible to being defunct versus quantitative research, then by the researcher, the investigator spending time in the field and understanding, then that should bring that added layer or research validity quite succinctly. The next point I want to make is about peer debriefing. So what this means is basically where if, those who are known authors around the research that is similar, or if not exactly the same even, around what the investigation is about that a researcher is doing, is being able to understand what peers and colleagues are doing or have done in align with the research that has been that has taken place. But also, apart from that, is also understanding where the gaps that they have missed to look to address, for example, by adding more validity and research around that in the research that an investigator is embarking on, for example, that they can prove and almost debrief the context with what their peers and colleagues have done, is actually should bring validity, and being able to, and by doing that also, it's highlighting that to those peers and colleagues that this sort of that context that is being investigated at the moment should have been part of retrospective research, or it should have happened, or they should have addressed the context in the research in a time when they were doing the research in context. Now, apart from this as well is external, a point I want to add which relates to external auditing. So what this means is that when doing research, and for example, when the research is finalized, or research is near completion, that there is a trail whereby in relating to research validity, that if the research is being explored externally or understood externally, that the investigators who are looking at the research from an external stance or perspective, what happens is that at each stage of the research process, that a verifier in one way or another can look at the different stages and say that, generally speaking, that the researcher and the investigation that has taken place has upheld integrity and validity throughout. So there's also so this is important, and basically this is just an overview on research validity from a quantitative research perspective and qualitative research perspective. Now, I'm going to go on to the next area around this, which is research ethics, and what's this all about in general. So some obvious do nots, some things that you should not do in in um, in approaching aspects that relate to research ethics. Um, Now, the first point to make here is it's important not to plagiarize or claim credit for other investigations or other investigatory work. That's important. The next point is misreport or invent results or submit questionable data without comment. So I said, so for example, in the previous slide to this, I mentioned, for example, about the triangulation context in relating to qualitative data, but also about research biases, etc. Now, it's very easy from both quantitative and qualitative perspectives to misreport or invent results. It's very easy to do so. And so thus, what can be done to offset that is ensure that there are appropriate citations and references according to current research that's being investigated, to ensure that that everything is being done to ensure that the data collected, whether quantitative or qualitative, has is not viable to it's not viable to misrepresentation or misreporting. So thus, it's important to have appropriate references to sort of ensure to ensure that the appropriate context has been put in place with the data that has been collected. The third point here is to be made is conceal objections and character or opposing views. So whilst everyone in the research world generally will have may have objections, it's important to ensure that you do researchers and investigators embarking on research should not conceal objections or have opposing views from the outset, in the beginning, or any researcher or investigator from the outset should look at research that has been done retrospectively, understand where trajectory lies in relating to aspects of research that has been done, whether quantitative or qualitative, and understand that generally researchers, investigators around the subject entity look to contribute knowledge around that. So it's important not to have imposing views and conceal any objections, though it is important to in context with research to ensure that there is a viable and appropriate research question that can be asked based on an area or a gap around the research that has not been investigated. In that context, it's important to note that that there should be some space for having sort of what can be referred to as light objections and having opposing views in a light sort of constructive in a constructive way. And by this, what I mean is ensuring that there are appropriate references and citations where there are do's and don'ts, is so to speak, in context with a research question or the aims and objectives around the research. So that's important. And the fourth point I want to make here is about destroy and conceal data or sources which could be useful to others. So what that means, if you're part of an academic team or a research team, for example, then it's important that whatever research is done, that any baseline data that has been collected, also, or the sources that have been identified. So yes, what happens is that it's important to understand that any data collection, albeit whether quantitative or qualitative, it's important um, not to destroy or conceal data or sources that could be useful to other investigators as part of an ongoing effort to contribute to the knowledge base around the subject entity. So that's important. It's important to have that in context with research ethics as well. So moving on, around the ethical theories and codes, two major ethical theories sort of exists. There's the consequentialist, or what's also referred to as teleological sort of ethical theories, where actions are good or bad depending on the practical consequences. And then there's the something that's referred to as the deontological, which is basically where there are acts that are good or bad in themselves. And so it's important to have an overview of the two major ethical theories, and these are theories that researchers and investigators around qualitative and quantitative research sort of abide by in context of ensuring that research around certain research questions are encouraged or implemented as part of the research part of the research journey, let's say. Now, codes of ethics adopted in professions or institutions generally sort of subscribe or prescribe a particular moral direction in the form of rules. So, for example, do not harm, do not lie, etc. So again, ethical theories and codes in this context really align to ensuring there is validity and integrity around the research, and by adopting ethics, but also institutions within themselves and professions in context where research exists or is implemented, and where, for example, health professionals also are involved, can be involved in research or practice or have code of practice. For example, listeners, you may be aware, for example, there's the Healthcare Professions Council, or HCPC. Now, in context with their guidelines, which, by the way, the Healthcare Professions Council has nothing to do with research, but in relating to healthcare practice. So, in order to become registered as a health professional of a particular profession or background, those who practice as specific healthcare professionals, have to be registered on the Healthcare Professionals Council. And in this context, it remarks based on the codes of ethics adopted in as healthcare professional, as a healthcare professional, but then also in context with institution in academic, or the academic world, or in academic institutions, for example, where ethics and theories and codes exist. It's ensuring that there's a fundamental basis by which the research that is being conducted has an appropriate sort of framework around codes of ethics, and there is literature to ensure for example, giving understanding and direction around not about ensuring not harming, and ensuring that investigators and researchers aren't lying about their research or the research that is being conducted. Now, the final point on this particular around ethical theories and codes is ensuring is this context around codes that can break down and may impede moral thinking, and that might be relating to different rules that may conflict. So there may be a conflict between, for example, the investigator and supervision, for example, in relating to academic supervision, or even in relating to supervision that might have been relating to external from an external perspective. So different rules may conflict on that basis. For example, put more simply, for example, academic research might have one way of doing research based on ethical theories and codes. Industry might have also have different ways of conducting research, etc. And again around ethical theories and codes, but the where they may have differences, or where they may have agreements, for example, is basically the ethical theories and codes may well be the same, but the approach is different. And so that when a researcher is doing investigation where it involves industry and academia, for example, there can be a paradox where basically the researcher for the purpose of putting it bluntly, and basically where the researcher, the investigator, can find themselves completely flummoxed because there's a conflict with how things are done in industry and how things are done from academic perspectives. So there's that. And then there's the rules that may not be universable to all situations or times. So that might be that, again, with ethical theories and codes, it might mean that for one set of situation, for one area of focus around a situation versus another, and again, in a perspective from academia and industry, there might be different sets of situations, and there may be ethical theories again on codes, ethical theories and codes that apply to both sort of sectors, so to speak, but at the same time, they might not be universal. So when it comes to the investigator putting their context in relating to, for example, a research ethics application or aspect relating to context of research more generally around a research question, then it's making sure that there's integrity, but but what's being asked is integral in line with situations and perspectives that actually join areas of industry and academia. That's the context here. Then there's the legalistic versus moralistic positions which may emerge. So legalistic, again, when doing things, research from a legalistic perspective, is ensuring that the ethical theories and codes are sort of embedded throughout. And then there's the moralistic position, which is basically ensuring that whatever is being identified or explored in relating to research is ensuring that there's a position whereby the context that comes out from a research question has the appropriate citations and references along with that, ensuring that that position has a moralistic focus, so that the research throughout has not just integrity and rigor, but there's validity throughout. And automatically what happens in some contexts is the legalistic aspects of the research are embedded as part of that process. That's not always the case in industry research. In industry research, um, um, depending on how research is conducted, the legalistic aspects may be offset, but to ensure the legalistic aspects are encompassed in industry research, in research that's done in industry, there has to be and there should be an academic collaborative effort, so that the moralistic aspects stay intact or are intact. Then there's the final point I'm going to make on this around the ethical theories and codes is ensuring that whatever is being asked as part of a research question cannot anticipate all moral conundrums or dilemmas or issues. And what that really means is that with every research question, it's going to pose there will be investigations or researchers looking to identify gaps in future research that's done around that prospectively or in future. And so therefore the moral dilemmas cannot always be anticipated. So the investigator or the researchers who are doing a current piece of research, they cannot possibly attack or understand every aspect of what's going on in what's in line with that research, but they can build on existing research to ensure that the moral dilemmas that could be encompassed with the current research are bridged with the appropriate context that align to number one, around the ethical theories and codes, and also number two is ensuring that they align with the validity and the rigor and the trustworthiness of the data that's being collected, so that those aspects can be anticipated, and it's what strengthens the research to offset any disambiguity in the research in the research that's been done. So these are a couple of points I want to that are part of this particular workshop. The next slide I'm going to highlight around are the ethical issues in a bit more detail, but these are the points really. The conduct of ethically informed research should be a goal of all researchers. So in line with sort of research practices around whether, albeit quantitative, qualitative, laboratory research focused, or any kind of research that's being conducted, is ensuring that there's a conduct around ethical and ethically informed aspect around the research, so that the investigation and integrity is upheld. Now, albeit it's important to highlight that in the academic world, in academia and in industry, there can be conflicts of intrigue quite easily, and what happens is that it can leave, unfortunately, from an ethical standpoint, where those in the industry and in academia, for example, may feel that they have upheld areas of ethics and conduct, can actually leave, unfortunately, investigators in limbo when it comes to doing their research. And so in this context, ethical issues need to be addressed from the outset, and if they've been if they have been addressed around a particular research question from the outset, this also means that whether it's quantitative research, whether it's qualitative research, whether it's laboratory practice-based research, then generally speaking, from an ethical stance, the investigator on their own, from an independent perspective, must ensure that all aspects of the research have aligned, so the ethical issues where there may be ethical issues and challenges, that they have been addressed from the outset. And then the second point on this is then saying that researchers can be confronted by a range of ethical problems, and that's obvious. The research ethics involve being clear about the nature of the research question or the agreement that you have entered into with research subjects or contracts. So things related to involving participants, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or laboratory research. Again, there has to be some transparency between the objectives that are being met from the different groups of involved. Again, whether industry, whether academic or industry, or in another area of practice. Now, key ethical issues in research can include confidentiality, anonymity, legality, professionalism, and participation. And believe me when I tell you that individuals out there doing research or conducting research can face conundrums and issues around all of these, because mainly, for example, if they're a healthcare professional and they want to conduct research, they may find themselves having conflicts with things relating to confidentiality, anonymity, legality, professionalism, and participation, because the investigators themselves may find that they're in kind of in the mix of all of those aspects, fighting sort of certain issues with ensuring that their research is upheld. And then from an academic perspective or an industry perspective, there is this issue where the confidentiality, for example, may be in breach in some aspects, the anonymity might be in breach, legality as well, professionalism, and participation. So the investigator themselves, in all the attempt to ensure that the research is upheld, it's not always it's upheld. The problem can be that the investigator has to ensure, again from the beginning, that the research is is ensuring that all of these points are addressed from the outset, because then that from the outset, because basically at that point, whether doing research in the industry or from an academic perspective or in both, for example, they've done everything, the investigator, the researcher has done everything to offset some of the issues that may cause conflict, but also ensure, obviously, that confidentiality, anonymity, legality, professionalism, and participation around aspects of the research are upheld throughout. Then there's the point around there are often ethical issues relating to topic and the methodology as such. And so basically, where I talked about the codes of ethics and the initial aspects around the theories, it's important that as part of or prior getting into the methodology around aspects around the research, it's ensuring that anything that might impeach or cause problems around the ethics, or where there are ethical issues, is ensuring that the investigator has an understanding around the codes and theories, and that should be part of either a proposal or in the research, or it should be highlighted as part of for example, in writing a peer-reviewed publication, or in writing a research thesis. So in a thesis context, there would be some context there around addressing the ethical issues in this context. Then finally on this point is research projects and proposals are commonly subject to ethical approval, and to codes of conduct. So there can be ethical issues around this. And so from the outset, again, it's ensuring that the projects and proposals have codes of conduct as part and parcel of the research that is being conducted. Okay, now I'm going to just go on to hopefully quite quickly onto this section around the need for ethical review and approval. So in the UK, ethical approval of research projects routinely are sought in healthcare settings, but less widespread in other contexts. So gradually spreading to cover other research involving human participants, and also research with animals that are governed separately, in relating to governance, that research with animals are licensed, and in this context, and an added context is the around need for ethical review or approval, is where universities introducing, or academic institutions introducing general procedures for research ethical approval must be based on, so there are 3 points here, must be based on original procedures for health or biological research, orientated towards or focused towards longer term research projects around a sort of research that are done, for example, at sort of a postgrad level, for example, master's or doctorate level research, and organized through a university or academic institution ethics committee, and a faculty of research ethics subcommittees, where that might be applicable. And from a healthcare perspective, a healthcare stance is ensuring that at least in the UK, there's the perspective around the what's referred to as the NHS Research Ethics Committee. So if research aligned with that has been done, or kind of been part and parcel and conducted as part of as part of a to look to address a research question or find answers to a research question, wherein an investigator or researcher has looked to do that, and these aspects have been integrated or integral as part of the research, then generally the ethics review and the approval, if it has been approved, then of that also in line with the validity and the rigor and the integrity around the research should actually be raised, and it shows the investigator and the researcher is upheld aspects of research practice. And then the next point I'm going to make, and this is something that I've come into understanding a little bit more recently, about the Belmont, something's referred to as the Belmont Principles. So the Belmont Principles are three main focuses. Number one, there's a respect for persons. So individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and those who are diminished and those with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So this implies the need for informed consent from participants. It is why all research, whether quantitative, qualitative, or laboratory research, whether industry or academic, for example, every participant involved in research generally have what's referred to as informed consent, that they're happy to participate in research. So that in this context is ensuring that the not only is the validity, integrity, and the trustworthiness of data that comes out of research is upheld sort of ultimately towards the end, and as part of the writing process that comes into play, but it's also ensuring that throughout the investigator and the work around the research around what is being investigated is ensuring that there's complete autonomy when the participant it has consented, is involved in the research. So that's a Belmont principle, and is a respect for persons. Then the part two is beneficence. And what this is where individuals should be protected from harm and efforts made to secure their well-being. So this implies the need for risk-benefit assessment in selection of research subjects. So when research, for example, so one example around this is where, for example, if research is being done from for example, NHS ethics application needs to be made, then basically what this implies is, and should imply, is the need and the requirement to ensure that throughout the research process, that people that those who are involved in the research, that they will be protected from harm. So even to the point where, for example, if there's an open-ended question, let's say around qualitative research versus quantitative research, or even in quantitative research, let's say, for example, that if there's an open-ended question, and let's say, for example, at a point, for example, in quantitative research, where researchers or investigators look to collect numerical data, if at the point that a participant looks at a question and understands the question completely, no problem, but feels intimidated by that question, then at that point they can say, I don't want to answer any more questions. And most surveys or quantitative research and researchers look to maximize some of their responses through online means, and basically the response rate can be lower, and it can be because of something as basic as the questions that are asked, that they may be too intimidating in some regard. And the same and in this context, when, let's say, for example qualitative research, and there are open questions around certain topics or entities around that, there can be issues. And one way, obviously, to offset that, and it's a very easy way to some extent, is where researchers or investigators may, for example, have issues or similar issues around health concerns, or issues as the participants who are involved in research as well. But apart from having wherein they have to have their own shield or a barrier to ensure that they are still doing their research. The research is still being done from an investigatory perspective, and not being done as the same as those who are participants. It's ensuring, from a beneficence perspective, is to also ensure that they should be protected from harm in that context as well. So automatically it should be implied that there is a need for a sort of assessment to ensure that the participants will be protected. Now, in this context as well, as part of the ethics application processes, generally speaking, all ethics application processes ask the question where investigators have to answer, for example, what aspects of the research in context with the research, what safety aspects have you implemented to ensure or reduce the risk around the participants getting in, being involved, etc. And so beneficence is important as another Belmont principle. And then the third and final point here is justice. And this means that benefits and burdens of research should be distributed equally or fairly. And what this means is that it implies the need for fair procedures and outcomes in the selection of research subjects. So in this context, it's ensuring that a bit like beneficence, and obviously a bit like respect for persons, it's ensuring that where for example, participants and even researchers, where they may feel burdened by aspects of the research question, for example, and the questions that might be formed, whether in qualitative or quantitative research, there needs to be fair procedures and outcomes in the selection, in selection or recruitment of participants, and those involved in research, to the extent where basically in relating to the validity and upholding trustworthiness and rigor around the research, is ensuring that there that in one way or another, that the participants benefit just as much as the investigators doing the research. So in context with ethics application process, one of the questions that are asked is how does the investigator look to ensure that the research is disseminated once finalized. So one of the answers to that, for example, and in line with the Belmont Principles, is in context of having a peer review publication, so the research is disseminated amongst amongst peers, and also amongst those who participated in a way that implies justice, fairness, and obviously again trustworthiness, etc. So these are the three main points around the Belmont Principles. And then I'm going to just talk a little bit about ethical considerations in the research process. So there is a research topic, there's a research topic or problem or statement. For example, will the research benefit or at least not disadvantage the participants? So that's important. The aims and research questions, are these conveyed honestly to participants? Is it clear who is sponsoring the work, for example, or who is funding the work? And then there's data collection. Participants' consent is required. They should not be at risk. Their privacy should also be protected, again in line with the ethical theories and principles, but also along Belmont Principles. Permission to access the research site must be gained, and the site should be disrupted as little as possible, so thus ensuring that participants involved in research, whether again quantitative or qualitative, that they feel safe, and they feel that they are protected. And then there's the data analysis and interpretation aspect around ethical considerations in the research process, is where data should be anonymized. So for example, even if for example, let's say in a blasé way, that that an investigator might even know a participant, right? And in some context, even if they answered on the consent form, for example, that they don't mind being named, as part of the process, the investigator must ensure that there should be anonymity to those who are involved. And so to this context, in this context, it means that, for example, in qualitative research, let's say, for example, in relating to anonymity, the investigator can have, for example, anonymized by, for example, a participant says a few words based on based on a response to a particular question, and then from an anonymous perspective or point of view, the investigator writes the first initial and the second initial of their first name and surname. And let's say if two participants have the same sort of initials, then the investigator can say have a number next to the two initials. So it can be, let's say, for example, JL1 and JL2. So it's anonymous either way. And data should be anonymized, stored and deleted in an orderly way, but only at the point after a certain number, a certain duration. So in some contexts, academic institutions, for example, do not allow data around research to be deleted or omitted until, for example, 5 to 10 years after that research has been conducted, for example. And data must be presented accurately and fairly, and its ownership may need ownership of who owns that data or who does that research belong to may need to be resolved. And that's part of the ethical aspects that relate to academic research and versus industry research. But in industry research, the principles are pretty much the same. And then again, I want to touch on a highlight on the basis of the dissemination of research of the results. So there's the biased language and distortion of results must be avoided. So there must be transparency and clarity in that regard. And impacts of audiences must be considered. So where is the research going to go? How is it going to be, for example, reviewed? How is it going to be disseminated? Who's the audience, etc., etc. And the data and methods are openly communicated. So generally speaking, when it comes to the ethical considerations in the general research process, these are just a few points that need to be sort of harnessed. And then there's some aspects around the access issues. So research may necessitate gaining access to particular documents, people, or even institutions. So the three main points here: whom do you need to see? How much of the time will you require? Whose consent do you need? And what will you have to record? What do you need to record? And then there's point 2: you can increase your chances of gaining access if your request for access is denied around particular research. There may be other approaches you can consider, generally speaking. And in the end, you have to focus on what is practically, or what's pragmatic, what's pragmatic and what's accessible. Research is the art of the feasible. So it's basically, in context of this, is that when someone embarks on research, the research question must be viable, must be feasible, but to investigate in the first place, the research of the investigator has to know the different ways in the way research is encountered. So research is much like some refer it as it can be referred to as a dark art, and in some context, in some context, even the most experienced of researchers will probably consider it to some extent as a dark art, because it's knowing how to navigate. And if you don't navigate, then basically there's this biased view, and often negative view, that research generally is, for example, it's not a career pathway. So So in this context, it's important for researchers, investigators, and those who are experienced and those who are not so experienced to know that research is one of those pathways in aspects of development, professional development, where basically when developing aspects of research or developing into other aspects of a career, the research generally is for those who like to think not so much outside of the box, although that is beneficial and advantageous, but it's actually for the agile minded who don't mind being tested and don't mind being thrown in the deep end around aspects of questions, so that even at the end of that there may not be anything that comes out of it, but at the same time it's then actually a place where researchers and investigation, that when it comes to having an answer to a particular question, it's knowing that the research has been conducted. So that's aspects relating to sort of the access issues, and sort of the baseline practicality aspects of research as well. I'm just going to delve into the ethical challenges, and there's just a couple of bullet points I'm gonna highlight here. Some common challenges are observing confidentiality when it would be useful to be able to include material in findings and in reports. Difficulties in adequately preserving anonymity. What do you do if you discover illegal activity in the course of your research? What do you do if you discover unprofessional practice in the course of your research? Untangling research on subjects and entities of research with participants, especially when working with vulnerable or marginal groups. And nowadays in research, at least from in the quantitative paradox and in the qualitative paradigm, basically everyone in aspects of healthcare research at least look to understand perspectives from those who are in vulnerable or marginal groups, and in retrospective research, for example, there has been research published from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective, to highlight that those who are in vulnerable groups or marginal groups, or for example disempowered groups, for example, also are very good at providing rich data, but that rich data or that rich data collection is only as good as the investigator getting involved as well, being immersed in getting a perspective from those vulnerable or marginal groups. Then there's the use of computer mediated communication, which can exacerbate some problems. So, for example, preserving confidentiality or a lack of direct contact, or again upholding rigor, integrity, or trustworthiness around the data, for example. So in some contexts, computer mediated communication or computer mediated interviews, for example, the transcription around the data that has been collected can be subject to scrutiny, and can be problematic for investigators, because when for example being asked about the questions, about the interviews that have been conducted, obviously the investigator has to ensure that they have done everything they can to ensure that research is the interviews and what's being conducted around that time have been upheld with absolute rigor and trustworthiness, but they have to be able to back that up with the appropriate references and resources. So ensuring that use of computer-mediated communication can be problematic in preserving, for example, confidentiality and even aspects around anonymity, but by having the appropriate references and context to sort of highlight that the data that's been collected has been done with absolute rigor, then actually the investigator is substantiating the case by highlighting in such a way. And now I'm going to go on to this this topic around sort of tackling the ethical dilemmas or the conundrums. And I'm just going to read a few points here. Codes of conduct of any research area, when available, may be useful in tackling ethical issues, but not if applied blindly. So a general process for resolving ethical issues are thus: number one, identify issues and sort of the parties involved, those participants involved, for example. And number two, identify a range of options for responding to the problem. Number three, consider positive and negative consequences from each option. Number four, analyze the options in relating to moral principles, i.e., for example, honesty, fairness, avoiding harm, etc. Number five, make considered and justifiable decision and act on those. And evaluate. Number six, evaluate and report dilemma and a resolution. So when it comes to reporting or writing up aspects of research, let's say, then all of these points can be related back into a subject into a section of a written piece of work in relating to limitations around the research. So and again, if there's if work has been referenced, then it should strengthen the aspects around the challenges, and that also should ensure that the integrity of the rigor and the validity around the research has been upheld in relating to resolving the ethical dilemmas or the issues. And that draws the end and closure for this first Re-Phew consulting workshop bit in this series around the ethics, around the research quality, validity, and ethics. This is part one of this particular workshop. The next one hopefully will be around questionnaire design and quantitative research. The one after that will be around literature review, composing a literature review, for example. The next one after that will be using social media in research, and then in the latter two parts of these the Re-Phew consulting workshop series will be research methodology part one and research methodology part two, and both of those will give an overview on quantitative and qualitative research more sort of generally, and all and the, in I just want to say in this in the Re-Phew consulting series workshop series, there is some references at the end of each slide, at the end of each presentation. Feel free to check out those at your own time, and I'm going to draw this to a close, and hopefully those who are looking at developing research are more than welcome to check out things through the Re-Phew consulting website and the different services that are available, and also check out the other videos and media around Re-Phew consulting at their own leisure to develop aspects around their own research and development. Thank you for listening.